Hey brothers and sisters, welcome back to the Behavior Revolution Scriptures, where we are making straight Yahusha's instructions, making straight his word, because his word is amazing. And when you dive into it and really start searching out things, you just feel alive. It's like food. It's more intoxicating than wine, better than food and drink. It's where we get our sustenance and our love and our peace from. So we're going to continue, brothers and sisters. We finished our last couple of videos talking about Noach and Noach's direct descendants, his sons. 2 of them were blessed and 1 of them were cursed. When we follow, let's go straight to Abram. We're going to talk about Abram, his name starts off Abram. Abram. And who is Abram? Let's go back to our family tree, because I like to summarize things to make it easy and user-friendly. So look, we've got the family tree of Noach here. So we've got down the obedient line here of Shem, these guys, and we've got Eber, and we talked about last episode he was where the word Hebrew came from, and that was what Abraham's family were called, Hebrews. We don't know why it was taken from this guy's name. We don't know what was so special about Eber. If I find out, I'll let you know, but I don't know what was special about him. But anyway, keep following this down here. Sarag to Nahor. Remember, Nahor was Abraham's grandfather, and Terah was his father. And by this stage, they were all pagan worshippers. They were all worshipping idols. And so that was just the way the world was. It says up the top there, after Noach died, they murdered and ate blood once again and lived in violence and fornication until the days of Abraham. So this is Abram down here. Abram had a brother Haran and a brother Nahor. So let's go to the text about Abram, because this is a whole big section. It's going to take multiple videos about Abram and how the covenant was made another step forward. Because remember the restoration of the covenant back to the Garden of Eden, back to loving relationship in the covenant home was the whole goal. And it can only come through a pure bloodline and through Mashiach Yahusha getting involved as well. So let's talk about Abram. 8 generations passed through Noach's son Shem. Then Terah, his descendant, had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran had a son named Lot and a daughter named Milcah. Then he died. So Haran, Abram's brother, died. Nahor married his brother Haran's daughter Milcah, and Abram married a woman named Sarai, which means quarrelsome, which is very true when we read on. And she was unable to have children. She was barren. Terah, a pagan, moved his family from the valley of and travelled just over 1,000 kilometres to Haran. Old versions say Haran, but it's actually Karan, on the way to the land of Canaan, where they settled before his death at 205 years old. So that's what his father did. Terah moved his whole family from the valley of and travelled just over 1,000 kilometres on foot, and camels, donkeys, whatever they had, 1,000 kilometres. Then, here we go. After many generations had disregarded the Creator, Yahusha came and spoke to Abram. I want you to move away from this land of your father's house, and I'll show you a better place. For I'm going to bless you incredibly, make you a mighty nation of people, and your name will be famous. I will put my protection all around you, showing favor to those who treat you kindly and punishing those who curse you. For through you, my son, all the nations of the earth will prosper and multiply. What an amazing thing to hear from Yahusha. He heard this from Yahusha. And he was obviously affected, because at the age of 75, he was 75 years old. Abraham gathered his household and flocks and possessions, and by belief left as Yahusha instructed, taking his nephew Lot and his family also. So he heard this and he believed the word and just moved. His whole family. and his nephew's family too. They moved. He didn't have the Ruach. He didn't have Yahusha inside him. He heard the audible voice and went, yep, I believe you, I'm going. And did what he was told. This was the thing about Abram. He had amazing belief. He stepped out and did things in belief. Just like Noah did. Spent 100 years building a boat. And I'm sure everybody around him was mocking the hell out of him. We've never seen rain before and you're building a stupid boat. Abram did the same thing. Stepped out and moved. And you never did that back in this time. You got bigger and bigger and your clans sort of went from the same spot. You didn't just move, migrate to a whole nother, almost another land. So by belief, he moved. Arriving in the land of Canaan, Abram settled in Shechem, which means strength, at the time when the Canaanites were still in the land. Canaanites. This was the cursed line of Ham, remember? The Canaanites. Some of them went into the Egypt area and some of them went into Canaan. So this was when the time of the Canaanites were still in the land. And Yahusha appeared to Abram again, saying, I'm giving all this land to you and your descendants. And Abram was so moved with gratefulness and awe of Yahusha's promises that he pitched their tents there and built a small platform out of stones, an altar, calling on the name of Yahuwah and sacrificing animals in his mighty name. So this was one of the first times documented in the actual formal scriptures that a stone table altar was made, a platform out of stones. And I'm going to go up, just because we're talking about the altar, I'm going to go straight up to the top here, because I want to refresh your memory about the altar. Look at this here. An altar, see the stone altar there? An altar was the most cherished place for a man, was his altar. It was a place of worship, of covenant, encounter, anointing, forgiveness, communication, a place to express his love for Yahusha. All these things that we have inside our earthly vessels now through the Spirit of Yahusha, they didn't have inside them back then. So if they wanted him to dwell with them, they built an altar. It was a place to express his love for Yahusha. Now, just because you built one didn't mean that Yahusha was going to communicate with you every time, but it was the way you worshipped. The altar is our heart behaviour, and we know that now. So I just wanted to refresh your memory about the altar. Let's find where we're up to again. Back to Abram. So Yahusha's told him to move, and he's gone and done it. Over 1,000 kilometres, all the way around down to the land of Canaan. Pitched his tents and was so overwhelmed with awe and thankfulness. Because imagine going into this pagan land and Yahusha says, I'm going to give all this land to you. Most would be like, how's that going to happen? There's people here already. Savage, violent people at that. Yahusha said, no, this land is all going to be yours. So he built an altar, sacrificing animals in his mighty name. Abram moved further south to 𝗓𝗏, which we used to call Bethel. Bethel. 𝗓𝗏. Beit means house, and Al means Elohim. 𝗓𝗏. So Abram moved further south to 𝗓𝗏 and built a stone table, again to honour Yahusha. But when a famine came in all the land, Abram became afraid. And instead of trusting in Yahusha's promise, he travelled down to Egypt. Dun, dun. Egypt. Nothing good ever happens in Egypt. Because that was the lawless descendants of Ham, where there was more food. Egypt at that time was the, I guess, the United States of the world. It was the most prolific, most advanced technologically. It was the superpower of the earth, Egypt at the time. Back then, the superpower. So they had obviously more food down there because the Pharaoh made sure he did. He was the most powerful king on the earth at the time, the Pharaoh, back in this era. The reigning dynasty in Egypt. So instead of, and we're going to see this in we're going to see this in Abram's life, that he was just like us. He was given a promise, but he stumbled constantly with his belief. But then he picked himself back up and kept going. And Yahusha worked with him. And that's the whole purpose of knowing about this, because we see that it's just like us. stumbling and falling, grappling with the promises. Is that really you talking to me, Father? This was Abram. He'd just been told all this and built a stone table altar. But then after a while, when there's not enough food, he gets afraid. And instead of waiting for Yahusha to do something about it, he moves his family down to Egypt, where there was more food. And as they approached Egypt, he says to his wife Sarai, "You are absolutely gorgeous to look at, my darling. And when the Egyptians see your beauty and find out that you're my wife, they will kill me just to have you for themselves. So we must tell them you're my sister for our safety." And when the Egyptians saw how attractive Sarai was, they praised her for her beauty, bringing her before the Pharaoh, who took her into his house as a slave, treating both her and Abram, her brother, very well, giving him sheep and cattle and camels. Because remember, our view of slaves and servants is tainted by the whole 400 years of slavery of Egypt, where they were treated really cruelly. But most of the time in Scripture, most families had a household servant or a slave, and they were treated really well, or should have been, and generally were. They had their own sort of property, possessions. They were like employees today. They weren't treated harshly. They were paid and looked after and fed well. So the boss, the Pharaoh, said, "Yeah, I want her." So he took her, because he had the right to, he was the king, took her as a slave, treating both her and Abram, her brother, very well, giving him sheep, cattle and camels. But Yahusha knew the intentions of the Pharaoh's heart regarding Sarai. He knew that the Pharaoh wanted to have her as his wife and, shack up with her. So Yahusha knew this about the Pharaoh, knew the intentions of his heart regarding Sarai, and began sending plagues of sickness to everyone in his home. What? So the Pharaoh takes slaves, and so Yahusha sends plagues. Does this sound familiar? When the Pharaoh realized who Sarai really was, he called Abram to him. He called Abram to him, saying, "Why on earth did you tell me she's your sister? Now everyone's sick because of you." They were plagues of sickness. "I was going to take her as my wife, but not anymore. Take your woman and get out of here immediately." And they escorted Abram, Sarai, and all their livestock and possessions out of Egypt. So even though they were slaves, they got possessions out of it. One of the other things they got out of it was their Egyptian slave Hagar. She was not of the covenant blessed line of Shem. She was from the mixed multitude, you could say, the wicked Goyim nations, which will, I'm saying this because it comes up later. She left Egypt with Abram, who was a covenant man, but she just was along for the ride. She was part of the mixed multitude, a mixed bloodline. She was part of the cursed line of Ham, an Egyptian. But it didn't mean she couldn't partake of the covenant if she got involved with what Abram was doing and was obedient. This pattern, we will see this pattern go on. It wasn't about bloodline after a while. Right now it's about bloodline because Ⅎ was so hell-bent on polluting it, and Messiah wanted to come through a clean, pure bloodline. So for the time being, it is all about bloodline, but also about belief and behaviour. So they were kicked out of Egypt after the plagues. Pharaoh told them to get out. Sound familiar? And Abram returned to the place near Beit-El in Canaan, where he had first settled and built the stone altar. And there he lived with all his household and an abundance of wealth, silver, gold, and livestock. And his possessions and people equaled many of the kings in the surrounding cities. And he honoured and feared the name of Yahuwah. So it's not just him and his family. He had the possessions and the people, the entourage that matched many of the nations around him, the kings around him. He was a force to be reckoned with. Yet he was sojourning. He was a traveller, a foreigner. He didn't have a land of his own. He had a promise for land. So imagine that. You've got more people and possessions than the nations around you. the kings around you, but you got no kingdom. You got no land. So can you see now why Yahusha coming to him and promising him a kingdom, a land to settle on, was so important to him? He was so overcome with awe about this promise. So they settled in that land because that was where the altar was. Why did they go back to 𝗓𝗓𝗓? Because that's where Yahusha had met him. And we know today, I mean, we have Yahusha in us all the time and hopefully communicating all the time, but we know when something phenomenal happens in our walk with Yahusha, we remember it fondly, we think about it, we want to go. Abram wanted to go back to the same place where he met Yahusha because maybe it would happen again if he behaved the right way. And that's why a lot of these landmarks were named after the altars that were there. This was Abram's nephew. Lot's family and herds lived among them also. But as the families and wealth and livestock increased, they all became very cramped for space, and the land couldn't support them all. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living among them too. Abram's herdsmen and servants began fighting with Lot's herdsmen and servants, and the tension was building between the two families. So Abram spoke to his nephew Lot, saying, "You know I love you, mate, but this just ain't working. We're all living in each other's pockets, and there's no space to move around here. All the servants and herdsmen are at each other's throats, and the feeling isn't very good in the camps right now. Let's not become enemies, eh? Let's separate our families, my brother. There's plenty of land further out, so you go one way and I'll go the other. Deal?" Straightforward. Nothing personal, mate. We just don't fit here anymore. We've got to spread out. And Lot looked to the east towards Sodom and Gomorrah and saw that the land was lush and well watered, similar to the garden in Eden. And he moved all his family and herds and possessions from Abram's family, who stayed in Canaan, to the cities and plains near Sodom, where the people were known for their inhospitable cruelty and depraved sexual acts of evil in every possible way. Right in Yahusha's face. So while we've got that sentence there still in our mind, where did Lot go? We were down here. So remember, it's not up on the map, but is right up here. Was right up here. They moved all the way down to Shechem, and then they went down to 𝗓𝗓𝗓, and then of course Egypt is right down over here. Egypt's over here. So he did his Egypt thing, got kicked out of Egypt, and he went back over to here, and they settled over here. But it was getting too big, too many people, not enough space, living in each other's pockets, everybody's bickering. So Lot moved down here. Some say Sodom and Gomorrah was further up here. Either, Lot moved over here, away from them and towards Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities there. And you can see just by the placement of the water, it would have been a lot more lush down here. So these nations down here, Sodom and Gomorrah, were known for their cruelty towards visitors and strangers, and also their sexual deviousness and depravity. Men with men, women with women, animals, you name it, it was happening. So Lot's moved, and Yahusha spoke to Abram, saying, "Check out all that land as far as your eyes can see, Abram. North, south, east and west. All of it I'm giving to you and your descendants forever. They shall be as many as the dust of the earth, uncountable in numbers. Now rise up and take hold of your inheritance. Go investigate and check it all out, son." So Abram did as Yahusha told him, and dwelt by the huge terebinth oak trees of Mamre in Hebron, building another stone table altar to celebrate Yahusha's promise. So he moved over to here, the terebinth trees over in Hebron in Mamre over there. So that's where he is. And I read somewhere interesting that back in this time, to take possession of land, to stake your claim, you had to walk around the perimeter of it. I thought that was interesting. So that's what his job was to do. Walk around, it's a pretty big area, by foot, the land of Canaan. And some say that he did that. during his time of wandering around. That's what he was wandering for. He was staking claim, walking around the whole perimeter, making altars and putting bits of it, you know, like you would on your land now. You put your stake, that's my property line. Put a stake there, you know. So that was interesting. Interesting to think about. That's what he was doing. Yahusha says, I've given it to you. Go and take it. And I'm guessing if anybody opposed him, there was a battle. Which brings us to Abram the conqueror. Not the barbarian, the conqueror. Great wars broke out, and this goes on for a big time. I've summarised it to make it make sense. Great wars broke out between the kingdoms that surrounded Abram and Lot in those days. 4 kings went to battle against 5 in the valley of Siddim, and both Sodom and Gomorrah were conquered and taken captive by the other savage nations. But a small few men escaped and ran for the mountains. A small few escaped and ran for the mountains, not just men. Lot and his family were taken prisoner during the battle. But one of the men who had escaped to the mountains, who lived close by to Abram and had a mutual respect with him, ran to Abram the Hebrew, because he was known as Abram the Hebrew, probably because of his descendant, whose name was Eba, which is Hebrew. So he ran to Abram and told him that his nephew had been captured. When Abram heard this, he geared up, arming his 318 trained servants, and headed out in grand pursuit. Another interesting question, which I didn't include in this because I thought it was a bit spooky and weird, but I'll tell you. A lot of commentaries suggest that when you look at the gematria and all that spooky weird stuff about numbers, all the scriptures form mathematical numbers, and I mean whether you accept that or not is, you know, who gives a rat's really. But when you look at the 318 gematria, it had everything to do with Abram's chief servant Eliezer. Remember the guy he sent out to find him a son one day? Put his hand on his nuts and made him promise to find him a son. Apparently that was the number that represented Eliezer. So many people believe that instead of arming 318 trained servants, this one man, Abram and his superpowered servant, went out and slaughtered all these men. I don't choose to believe that myself, but it's interesting concept that Eliezer was a superpowered. He was given supernatural strength to win the battle, which is not, you know, we see that happen through the wilderness all the time, supernatural strength assisting Yisrael. But I'd rather go with the fact that Scripture says he armed 318 servants, and we know he had that many servants, stacks more. So he formed his little army who were trained and ready to go, and they head out. Interesting to talk about these weird interpretations sometimes. Abram and his servants divided and conquered the enemy camp by night, attacking them as far as Damascus, rescuing many people, including Lot and his family, and all of their possessions too. The king of Sodom was so thankful to Abram and his special forces team, saying, "Take all of the possessions and treasures that you have gained from my enemies, but please return our people." But Abram said, "My master Yahuwah has won the battle today. He owns everything on the earth and in the skies. It is he and only he that makes me rich and victorious, no one else. So I only require what my servants have eaten on the journey, and that is enough reward for me." He didn't want anybody to say that it was because of me that Abraham was rich, because he relied wholly and solely on Yahusha. He says that, "My master Yahuwah has won the battle today, not me. He owns everything on the earth and in the skies, and it is he and only he that makes me rich and victorious. No one else." But I'll just take a bit of food because, you know, we got to eat, man. Then we come to a very interesting section about this dude called Melchizedek. And I've made it simple. I mean, it's taken people hundreds of years to work out who Melchizedek was. Who was it? Was it Epiphany? Was it an angel? Was it this? Was it that person? Was it Michael the angel? Oh, there's so many weird theories. But when you read what the epistles say, when the Gospels and the New Testament covenant writing, when you read them, it pretty much makes it clear who this being was. So just for the sake of user friendliness, I've added it all in, changed it all around and made it readable. So Abram was still coming back from their victory, their battle. And while they were travelling home from battle, Yahusha actually appeared to Abram as a man. Yahusha the Son is the appearance of Yahuwah the Father in physical human form, and he introduced himself to Abram as 𝗪𝗔𝗧𝗪, King of Shalem, peace. I'll make a little note here too, if you haven't watched the earlier videos and read the foreword, that I'm using the word Yahusha all through these scriptures when referring in the narrative. Yahusha did this, and Yahusha spoke to Abram, and Yahusha appeared to Abram. The only time I'm using the word Yahuwah is when someone is speaking, because obviously they only knew the name Yahuwah at that point. But I'm going to refer to him as Yahusha because that's who he was. And I want you to understand, I want people to understand that it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 100 people in the deity head. No, there were a father and a son, and they were one. And there's many scriptures that say that. I am one. So when you're talking about Yahuwah, you're talking about Yahusha. You're talking about Yahusha, you're talking about the Yahuwah. The Father and the Son are one. The Son is the physical manifestation of the Father. And because he appeared in physical human form, was he flesh and blood? Who knows? When Yahusha was born as flesh and blood through the virgin birth, he took on flesh in physical form. And so he became a man, he appeared, he took on flesh for our deliverance. So we've got Yahuwah is our deliverance. That's what the name Yahusha means. So we're not being sacrilegious by not using the name Yahuwah, because when we use the name Yahusha, we are using the name Yahuwah. Does that make sense? We are using the name Yahuwah plus deliverance. So we're not casting the name of Yahuwah to ruin, because we are using the name. When you use the name Yahusha, you are using the name Yahuwah plus what he's doing, delivering. So I've used the name Yahusha here because we know it was Yahusha. 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪 was Yahusha. Yahusha the Son is the appearance of Yahuwah the Father in physical human form. So even if it just appeared as a man, later on he appeared to, remember he wrestled with Jacob. Remember he wrestled with him. So it was Yahusha. He wrestled with him. And he introduced himself to Abram as 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪, King of Shalem, peace, High Priest of the Most High Elohim, Mighty One. Most High Elohim, offering bread and wine to Abram and his band of men. And as they shared a meal together, he said, "What a wonderful victory and blessing Yahuwah has given you all today. Blessed are you, Abram, Yahuwah's servant, and blessed is Yahuwah, the Most High Creator of the earth and the skies." So many want to make a connection between the bread and the wine and the weekly communion, and you've got to put the thing on your tongue, and the holding up the cup and the wine and the Last Supper and all this. It came from 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪. Remember the bread and the wine? It must. That's not why. That's not at all what this is about. Bread and blood and wine has significance, but he shared a meal with them, encouraged them, blessed them. And this phenomenal encounter with 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪 left Abram awestruck, and he even offered him 1/10 of everything he owned, for he knew he'd just met the Creator. The significance of this is there's no one else on the earth at this time as not really a mediator at this point, because he hadn't received a covenant yet, but there's no one else hearing from Yahusha on the earth at this point. So as far as status goes, Abram's the top dog. So there's no one higher in status on the earth as far as Yahusha is concerned, as far as speaking to him, than Abram. And yet Abram offers 1/10 of everything he owns to Yahusha, to 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪. So as far as priesthoods are concerned, later on it gets into the priesthoods and the offerings of the tithe to support the tabernacle, but it shows here, just in its purest form, that 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗪 Yahusha, is a higher priesthood than the Levitical priesthood is lower than Yahusha's priesthood, which of course is us today, kings and priests to the nations. That's Yisrael, but that's another topic. So that's an interesting thing here. This is the only time until the priesthood shows up after the Exodus that we're talking about tithes. Tithe is a tenth of everything. You know, that's how awestruck he was. This rich man, he was rich. He was richer than half the kings. Offered a tenth of everything he owned to Melchizedek because he knew he'd met the Creator. That's the thing I want you to understand. He knew he'd met Yahusha. Some form of him anyway, because human being can't look upon the Creator. So where are we at? 32 minutes. We can go into this. Let's go into the covenant, because this is the whole thrust of introducing us to Abram. Yahusha made a covenant with Abram and took great strides in moving this covenant forward. This covenant that he had, covenant agreement of instructions he had with Adam and 𝗂𝗏, broken. Then he reformed another covenant with Noach, and now he's raising another covenant and the same covenant. He's lifting up the covenant again with Abram, because no one on the earth knew about it. They'd all forgotten. They're all lawless again. So he's raising up the covenant once more. And it's very fascinating what he does with his covenant. So after they all returned home, Yahusha appeared to Abram again. Appeared to him. This time in a vision. Saying, it's okay, Abram, don't fear me. Because imagine, you've just seen a ghost, an epiphany of somebody. You're seeing a vision. Don't worry, mate. It's okay. It's just me. I am your protector and shield. And your inheritance from me is going to be amazing. So we know this is Yahusha here as well, because Yahusha is our protector and our shield. But Abram said, my master, what's the point of being so blessed if I have no children to give it to, and my only heir is Eliezer, my servant? Eliezer? Let's call him Eliezer. Yeah. So he's basically saying, and this shows us the mindset back then of being blessed. He had all this inheritance, more than most of the kings surrounding him, but he had no land, but a promise for land, and he had no son. And that was the most, above the land, above the kingdom, a man's son, a man's family was the highest of possessions. And that also came down to his wife as well. That's why she felt like crap, because she couldn't provide. She was barren, and that was the main purpose, role for the women back then, was to provide, particularly a firstborn son for her husband. So this is the thing he's grappling with right now. Yahusha's going on about being blessed, and it's amazing. I'll be your shield and protector. Your inheritance is going to be amazing. Abram's like, what's the point of all this blessing, Father, if I've got no son? I've got no one to give it to. You promised me all this inheritance and people and, descendants, but I got no one. I've only got Eliezer, my servant. Is that who you're talking about? Do I have to give all this to my servant? Yahusha says, no, Eliezer is not who I'm talking about. And taking him outside, he said, look up at the skies, my son, and see all the stars. So many you can't even count them. That's how many children you will be the father to. I am Yahuwah, who brought you out from your father's house to give you this great land as an inheritance. I am Yahuwah, who brought you out. It's like the commandments, isn't it? I am Yahuwah, who brought you out of the land of slavery. I am Yahuwah, who brought you out from your father's house, which was pagan slavery, basically, paganism, to give you this great land as an inheritance. And Abram trusted in every word that Yahusha spoke. Trusted in every word that Yahusha spoke. And in such an unrepentant world, he found great favor with Yahusha because of his strong belief. And he said, my master, when will I actually receive these promises? When will you make it official with me? Other translations say, Father, when will I know that I possess this blessing? How will I know that I possess it? In other words, when will I actually receive these promises? When will you make it official with me? In other words, I'll put that in turquoise here. When will you make an official blood covenant promise with me? Because once you had that, it was like signing on the dotted line. You had a piece of paper, we have a piece of paper, stating, or like the deed to a house. It's yours because you've got the deed, you know, like it's a covenant agreement. He didn't have that yet. All he had was Yahusha's word, which he believed in and trusted 100%. But the formal blood covenant had not been made with him. And he knew that because, let me digress a bit. Back in these times, the only way to make a covenant with somebody, whether it be about a sheep or a goat or a piece of land or a bride, or any way to make an agreement with somebody was through blood. Today we have contracts drawn up and we sign our signature, which is like our seal of approval, our signature. Back then it was all about blood. So they'd have to sacrifice an animal, and they would cut the animal up, and both parties, both people making an agreement, would walk between. There'd be a channel, they'd walk between the cut up animals, and they'd obviously get a bit of blood on them, and that was a blood covenant. It's like, remember, making a blood oath with somebody. You'd cut the blood, cut their wrist. That's why in those Robin Hood movies, they slice his hand with it. I swear it on my own blood, I'll avenge my father. You know, it's blood on my blood. There's the significance of the blood. So this is the blood covenant. So in Abram's mind, as much as he's believing in Yahusha, he says to him, when are you going to make this official? When are you going to make a covenant with me? That's what he's saying. So Yahusha says, okay, mate, go and get me a cow, young cow, goat, sheep, dove, and pigeon, please. And Abram spent the whole day doing so, cutting all, except the birds, down the middle, and he placed each half of the animal right opposite the other half on the ground, creating a small channel between them to walk through, which was covered with animal blood. Obviously, there's blood gushing out of all the animals. And this was setting the scene for how Abram knew an official blood covenant promise was to be made. So this wouldn't have been weird to him. Like, what have I got to cut all these animals up for? No, he knew the minute Yahusha said, go and gather these animals, he's like, oh, I'm getting a covenant, I'm getting a covenant. So let's go down to the picture here. This makes it a bit more visual for you. Animals cut in half with a channel of blood running between them. So you've got Father Abram up there, and you've got the doves, you've got two doves there, and you've got the animals that are cut in half either side and the blood running through them. And I've made a point here of saying covenants in the Eastern world are not like the agreements or contracts we make in the Western world today, which are broken constantly with little or no consequence. A blood covenant, especially with Yahusha, involved the shedding of blood either from both parties or an animal. And if broken, the blood, which was the life, remember, the blood of the guilty party was required as penalty. That makes sense? That's the whole idea of a blood covenant. If the blood covenant was broken, the guilty party had to shed their blood. They're dead. That's why Adam and 𝗂𝗏 should have been destroyed the day they disobeyed him. But blood was shed by the lamb instead, and they were clothed through the lamb as well. So Abram knew all this. He knew how people made covenants. And we'll see later on in the scriptures that people made covenants all the time about land, about sovereignty, about not fighting one another. They about peace. They made covenants all the time, cut up animals and walk between them. So this was not a strange thing for Abram. So he did it. He set the scene. Apparently, vultures tried to attack him at one point too. And as the sun was setting, Yahusha put Abram into a very deep, dark sleep, so that he was almost dead. And many have said that this was like a coma, similar to when he created 𝗂𝗏 from Adam's rib. Significance of this is amazing. Just as when Adam was put into a deep sleep or his coma, like a death, Adam had to die, and when he came back to life, he had a marriage. Just as Adam's death and resurrection brought about a marriage, so would Abram's. And while Abram was out cold in his coma, his deathly coma, significant of death, Yahusha said to Abram, your descendants will be strangers and foreigners in a land that's not theirs. Interesting that he says this now while he's dead, while he's in a coma, while he's in a deathly state. He's talking about his covenant people going into Egyptian slavery. Your descendants will be strangers and foreigners in a land that's not theirs, and they will be slaves for 400 years. But after that, I'm going to punish that nation and bring all your family out with great wealth and possessions. But you, Abram, will not see any of this, for you will be you will be long gone, dead and buried at a ripe old age. And after 4 generations of slavery, I will deliver your family, and then they'll return here to this land I've promised you. For the wickedness of the Amorites here in Canaan must follow its course first. That's a hell of a promise, isn't it? To give to Abram. And it's official too, because it's in this deathly state while the covenant is being cut. And as the sun went down and a new day of promise begun, Yahusha actually passed through all the animal pieces himself instead of both parties, because both parties were supposed to walk through. The covenant agreement was made between 2 people. They both had to walk through. The cut up animals, which meant if either one of them broke the covenant, the other would have to shed their blood. So what does it mean if only one person walks through the covenant for both parties? It would mean that if the covenant was broken, that one person would have to shed their blood, wouldn't it? Are you seeing where I'm going with this? So he passed through the animal pieces himself instead of both parties, as a burning fire and a smoking furnace, consummating the promise of this blood covenant as the mediator and the payment between he and Abram, saying, today I raise up my eternal blood covenant of deliverance with you. I have given all this land to the seed of your body, Abram, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River. So, interesting there, Yahusha appears as a burning fire and a smoking furnace. So fire and smoke. What did Yahusha appear to the nation of Israel as he led them through the wilderness? At night time he was a burning fire, and during the day he was a smoking furnace, a cloud. So that's how he appeared. And he consummated the promise of this blood covenant as the mediator and the payment. In other words, if the covenant was broken, he would take the blame. He would take the responsibility for it. And it all came down to blood, of course. Today I raise up my eternal blood covenant of deliverance with you, Abram. I've given all this land to the seed of your body, Abram, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River. This whole thing about the land is interesting because we're dealing with 2 men. We're probably not going to talk about this episode. We'll go next episode. But Abram is not Abraham. Abram, who was uncircumcised, who was still given a covenant. Abram, obviously they're the same guy, but significantly they're 2 different promises, 2 different covenants. So we can see this, look at this map down here. This promised land here was given to Abram. And it says, what does it say up there? From the river of Egypt to the Euphrates River. So the river of Egypt obviously is here, the Nile, the river of Egypt, all the way over here to the Euphrates River. That's a lot of land. And I mean, Canaan, the land of Canaan is just over here, near this big P, the promised land. That's the land of Canaan over here. That's the land Abraham was promised. The 12 tribes of Israel were promised that land there. But the descendants of the descendants of an uncircumcised Abram were given this land here. And this is where, of course, all this Middle East debacle and who is the most holy of people and who should take over Jerusalem and all this stuff, which means nothing anyway because it's all earthly. The New Jerusalem will be a different city that comes down from the clouds. But we see all this conflict going on between the seed of Abram's body. Abraham's seed was very different. Abraham's covenant seed was very different. But we're not going to go into that right now. We're just going to leave it there, I think, because we could go on. The whole story of Abram at this point is just fascinating. It's laying a framework. It's laying a foundation of what, of course, Yahusha is going to fill up. It's like putting an empty glass here. This is the framework, and of course, over time, Yahusha is going to fill up that glass. And each covenant that was formed, the same covenant, I've got to stop saying that, it's the same covenant. Each time the covenant was renewed, I should say, the glass got more and more fulfilled until, of course, Yahusha just, my cup runneth over. But it's the same covenant. It started off with the instructions, and the instructions are all the same always. But he starts making it more and more powerful, this covenant. So we see now with Abram that he's actually made a blood covenant again with Abram. And it's not just a covenant like he made with Noach, that it was one-sided in that I won't destroy the earth again. No matter what you all do to disobey me, I won't destroy the earth again with a flood. Whereas this covenant here was very different. This covenant was a two-sided covenant, and they had to be obedient. It had consequences if you didn't obey the covenant. But as we saw, the consequences would fall on the person who cut the covenant, who walked between the pieces, which was Yahusha himself, appearing as a smoking furnace and a fire. And the whole idea of the smoking furnace and the column of smoke, it's all to do with the covenant house again in Bereshith. Covenant house forged in fire and water and blood. It's all connected when you look at the Hebrew words. So we're going to go more into, I've written down here, interestingly, Yahusha gave Abram this promised land, outlined here, but to Abraham, he only gave the land of Canaan, which was later divided between the 12 tribes of Israel. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. This is just laying a pattern, and that's why I'm going into this and harping on it a bit about the eternal blood covenant, because it's laying down a pattern which still lives and is alive today. The eternal blood covenant of deliverance is alive and well today because Yahusha is alive. Yahusha lives outside of time. He can be in the past, the present, and the future all at the same time. So time is not a factor to him. Time is just something that he's seeing through, like a stopwatch going. And when it's finished, he's got something else planned. And I want to see what it is. So I want to be part of his bride. So no one's going to knock me off the path. So this whole point of the blood covenant, we're seeing the early stages of the pattern. We've gone from Noach, which is more of a simpler covenant, one-sided covenant, to Abram now, where it's to do with the land. The promise was about the land, because remember, Abram was practically a king without a kingdom. He had all these people and all these possessions, didn't have a son, which he was upset about. So was his wife, even more so. And he didn't have anywhere that was his own. He didn't have any land. And that was a big deal to Abram as well. And we're going to go more into that as we go on. So, I love you, brothers and sisters. Stay tuned. More on Abram soon. See you later.